Shri Arvindaya Namaha. I am very happy to be here the second morning and now getting into the thick and thin of the things, because yesterday we had an introduction. Of course, it was very meaningful because it stated some of the fundamental things. But I'm going to go a little deeper today into specific things. The topic that I have been assigned is the tremendous vitality of Indian culture. But I am going to talk about it in relation to Sri Aurobindo. Or to put it another way, I am going to recall and recapture how Sri Aurobindo thinks that this is one of the most crucial things. And he says this in an essay which I'm sure most of you may know. Most of you who have now come to study Aurobindo ji must know. This is called The Renaissance in India. It's not a very big essay. It's one of the essays from what later on became a whole book and has many things. But this, about 16 pages or so, even less actually, encaptures the most essential idea of Sri Aurobindo. Why is he so important to us? Of course, we have had a series of great leaders since 19th century who set the new trend of reasserting India in the face of the British Empire. People like Swami Dayanand, a little later, all the great stalwarts of the Brahmo Samaj, Vivekanand, then Aurobindo, later on Gandhi and Lajpat Rai and Tilak, and you know the long gallery of great luminaries who helped India find its feet in the 20th century, to rise to its own freedom from the British yoke, and also to set an example before almost a dozen other countries to free themselves from the political dominance of the British. Aurobindo is certainly one of these great political fighters, but Sri Aurobindo is much more. As you all know, he went out of direct political action in 1910. So it was roughly from 1880 to 1910, or even a little less, that he was actively politically contributing and leading a movement which was very different from what is remembered as the Indian struggle for independence, which was capitalized by Gandhi and Nehru and the Congress Party. But the vision of Aurobindo was entirely different. In my understanding, they are two banks of the river, but opposite banks. Aurobindo has nothing in common with Gandhi. Gandhi has nothing in common with Aurobindo. And if one has to talk about the vitality of India, Gandhi is of no help whatsoever. I am a politically incorrect speaker. I have been so since my first year in college. I went to a college where they prepared, I went to college in 1960, in 60, where they prepared the future administrators, the IFS and IAS of India. And I used to go to my classes wearing a kurta. 1964. And I declared that I was not going to be an IAS, I am not going to toil or learn anything in order to appear for the civil service examination. I had come to college because at that time that college had the best library in Delhi University. Maybe still, but perhaps not. At that time it did, and it had the best gardens. So the two classical things, a wonderful library and gardens. These, as you know, are fundamentals of learning. Aurobindo, even when he was a politician, he was much more than a politician. He was almost what is called in traditional language, although it is not used by followers of Sri Aurobindo, but he was, in our traditional Hindu sense, an avatar. Because he brought in body, in material terms, a transformation which is spiritual and intellectual as well as physical, which had a totality. It was not a concept of civil rights. It was not a movement of civil rights. It was not defining India in terms of a different political nation as it became with Gandhi onwards. With Aurobindo, it remains what it was since Rig Veda. In my humble understanding, the tradition of Rig Veda or Veda Mata, as it is called in traditional language, it is not, Veda Mata is not just a philosophy, it's a total philosophy of living, worshipping, creating, making a civilization, conquering others physically as well. That is the Vedic spirit which Aurobindo restated for us. And to my mind, there is nobody who does it so completely. It is in this that the vitality of his philosophy, his ideals resides. And it is not a vitality which is specific to his doctrine. It is the vitality of the Indian tradition, the Bharatiya tradition. So, Sri Aurobindo, when he talks about the tremendous potential of India and the immense vitality of India, he is talking of something which we lost in our political struggle when he came to Pondicherry. Because those who took the torch of the freedom struggle for him were essentially non-Vedic. And they were people who were following in some way or the other more of a European idea of freedom, more of a European idea of social structure. It was not welfare of the total human being or the total society or total humanity. It was the welfare of a state which later on becomes a socialist state, and nothing can be more anti-Hindu, anti-Bharatiya, anti-Indian than socialism or communism. So when you talk of vitality, you just don't talk of exuberance, or you don't talk of its modern American version of happiness in terms of fun or kicking it up or celebrating it like the great fat Indian wedding we just had. It's not that superficial vitality. It is the vitality of the four Purusharthas: Dharma, Artha, Kam and Moksha. And I'll read out to you some lines where Aurobindo says this. He may not use the word Kama or Moksha, but he has used the word Dharma and he has used Shastra in this essay. Now, what is the first thing that Sri Aurobindo puts forth? The first thing he has to say, in order to reclaim this vital spirit of India, or this Purushartha of India, the first thing he says is that we cannot be defined as the Indologists or Orientalists of the 19th century were trying to do. And so he contests the very common idea which was being propagated by sympathetic Westerners. The idea that India is primarily, fundamentally, essentially a spiritual land. You know, in the 19th century, there were very clearly two approaches to India in the West. One was the entirely colonial approach, which looked upon India as a corrupted, static place. For the missionaries, it was the land of idol worshippers. But even for some great intellectuals who were in one way or the other more like utilitarians, you know, this Benthamites and utilitarians of the 17th century, who looked upon welfare and human happiness only in physical terms or social terms. And all this was a very great reaction actually first to Christianity and even to the Greek tradition, which they always said that they are following. They define social welfare, goodness, in terms of certain values which they found entirely missing in India. And they said that India is not material, India is spiritual. What they meant was that India is too self-centered, going too much inward, lost in itself. And they praised it. And most of us, if you see the writings of that period, were fascinated by it and taken by it. So Sri Aurobindo demolishes that first of all. He says, no, this is a double catch. They are praising you for being spiritual, elevated, and calling that as the most essential thing, and thus denying what you really are in totality. Now, there was a period, certainly a period, especially the period under Islamic rule, when a lot of spirituality was turned into self-centeredness, into some kind of escapism, and people thought that a spiritual pursuit or pursuit of God or divine was the most essential thing. That should be the priority in life. As Tulsidas has a line that Deha dhare kar yeh phal pai, bhajiye Ram sab kaam bihai. Leave everything else, just worship Ram. So this is the escapism of the Bhakti period. This was a reality. And this was redefined and studied by the colonizer and resold to us. So Sri Aurobindo breaks that down. Yes, others were also doing it, like Dayanand Saraswati. Dayanand Saraswati was putting it, denying it, revitalizing certain sections of society. But Aurobindo, he had the great big vision. So the first thing he says is that if India is to rise, if India is to revive itself, then it must look to its total past. See, it must first of all denounce this European myth, what Europeans have cultivated, that we are a spiritual religion. And it must understand the genius, and he says it here very clearly, the new birth of India, if it is a fact, must become a thing of immense importance both to herself and to the world. To herself, because all that is meant for her in the recovery or the change of the old-time spirit and national ideals. To the world, because the possibilities involved in re-arising of a force that is in many respects unlike any other, and its genius is very different from the mentality and the spirit of modernity. So, see, he's saying two very specific things. That if India is to arise, it will not do it just for its own sake. it cannot do it only for its own sake. It has to arise in order to influence the rest of the world also. You see, this is very important in his writings and in his thought from very early times. It's very important. He never thinks of the nation and the role of the nation and the revitalizing and rising of the nation only in terms of the nation. So, Aurobindo is not taking the European nationhood as an ideal to be followed by people of India. He is very clear that Indian nationhood, Indian nationality, Indian nationalism is very different. You see, we still have that struggle. It's the biggest struggle in the last 20 years. Because in Germany, in France, in the leftists in America, they all think of nationalism as a dirty concept, as a dangerous concept. And they call the major political party as a threat because it is nationalist. And Hindu nationalism is considered by the learned in Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Berkeley as dangerous people. So that prejudice politically still continues. Aurobindo had very early made it clear that India's nationalism is not going to be like German nationalism. Your problem is different. You have fought 2 world wars in which you used Indian soldiers perhaps more than you use your own soldiers, but in any case you were fighting your concept of nation and nationhood. Indian nationhood is different. That is why he goes on to define what nationhood will be. He does that separately, as you might know, in that very famous speech called Uttarpada speech, where he says that Indian nationalism is Sanatan Dharma, and Sanatan Dharma is Indian nationalism, and Sanatan Dharma is Vishwa Dharma in the sense that it is for the benefit of all. It is not a prescription for everybody. It is not to be followed in letter by others, but it is something which includes the welfare of others. That's something he says very clearly in 1907, I think, Uttarpada speech. 9, when he came immediately out of the Alipur jail. All right. So that is a crucial idea of the vitality of India and the vital spirit of India. So first of all, his definition that India is not going to be alone when it arises, that it shall take others with it. And please understand that this is not a patronizing approach. हम उठेंगे तो आपको भी उठा लेंगे. We'll give you aram. No, this is not it. Because arising itself is a struggle. And if I do that, then I am taking others because I considered others not as separate, not as others. It's a very fundamental thing. So, then, Aurobindo is also very clear about it. The second thing he is most adamant about. He says The Renaissance in Europe, from 15th, 16th century, was based upon a rediscovery of ancient Greece and Rome. The texts and the art and the philosophies and the sciences which were practiced in the Homeric age and the classical age of Pericles, and later on in the age of the Roman Empire and empire building, etc. They revived themselves in the face of the tyranny of the Christian doctrine and Christian church. They revived themselves by borrowing ideals from Greece and Rome. This is very important. European Renaissance was a borrowed Renaissance. Very few people have the courage to say it. Aurobindo makes it clear that Indian Renaissance is not going to be on anybody else's texts and books. If you have to revive yourself, you will do it on your own tradition, on your own texts. See, European culture to which it was first applied, that was not so much a reawakening as an overturn and reversal, a seizure of the Christianized, Teutonized, feudalized Europe by the Greco-Latin spirit and form, with all the complex and momentous results which came from it. That is certainly not a type of Renaissance that is at all possible in India. So he says this model of revival and Renaissance cannot help us. Very clear. He has another paragraph defining it. Then he says, what shall be our? And he says it can be our own. But at the moment, he says, the most important thing when he was writing, he says that it is the great vitality or the Shakti of India which is most important. On the whole, what we see is a giant Shakti who is awakening into a new world, a new and alien environment. So it is the Shakti of India. He is not talking about a single text like Rig Veda, or he later on mentioned them and defined them. But he says that it is the overall Shakti, the vitality. So Aurobindo reaffirms the traditional idea of what is power, what is vitality, and he uses the traditional term Shakti. So he says this is Shakti. Now here I'll try to remind you that this idea was common to almost all the people who were thinking of Indian nationalism. Very early, Indian nationalism came to be defined as the devotion and the loyalty that the people of India have towards their land, which is seen as Mother, Mata, Bharat Mata. And you find that you have that painting, the first painting, I forget the name of the Avanindranath Ghosh perhaps, huh? Yeah. So, what is he painting? He is painting Bharat Mata. And Mata means Shakti. So, the mother, Aurobindo makes it very clear that this nationalism is not at all the linguistic nationalism which came into existence in Europe from 18th century onwards, when books were printed and people could see their language and their territory, and they defined themselves specifically as the English nation, the French nation, the German nation, Italian nation, Greek nation. No, it's a very different kind of a understanding of this great vital force, and that is why Bharat Mata. And to this day we have this conflict. It's so difficult to convince a Harvard professor that my Indian nationalism is my loyalty to Bharat Mata. A Christian or a Muslim finds it impossible to understand how can you think of a nation, first of all in terms of a female definition, because there is no female god in Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It's blasphemy to think of that. And how can you associate the land, the people, the vegetation, the mountains, the rivers, all that, and the animals and birds and plants, everything in the concept of the nation? But this is the concept of Indian nationhood in ancient as well as in modern times. And I have read out Aurobindo to you, and you have the painting on the wall. Now, after making this analysis of the rise of India, the vitality of India, he says that it is a time when India will certainly keep her essential spirit, will keep her characteristic soul, but there is likely to be a great change in the body. However, all that change will be based upon ancient principles, not newfangled ideas. The shaping itself of a new body, of a new philosophical, artistic, literary, cultural, political, social forms by the same soul, rejuvenant will be the type of Indian Renaissance. Forms not contrary to the truths of life which the old expressed, but rather truths restated, cured of defect and completed. So, what will be the foundation of our restructuring and revival? The ancient ideas, the ancient texts, the ancient philosophies. It is on them that we will have our Renaissance. This is again very different from the European Renaissance, because the European Renaissance was reactive to Christianity, number one, and that it was taking the ideals of life of an age and a people who were far removed from them and who they considered as pagans, as people who would go to hell. You know, the great poet Dante, who wrote that poem La Divina Commedia, when he visits hell, then he sees the great Greek philosophers sitting there. They say, yes, they will be in upper circles, but they will be in hell. They can't go to heaven because they never were saved by Jesus. So if you never came to Jesus, because Jesus had said that nobody shall come to the Father except through me, so they are in hell. And as you go down deep and deep and deep, in the deepest circle, you have Satan. And in one circle above Satan, you have Hazrat Muhammad. Because he divided the Judaic tradition, he divided the Christian tradition into two. He created schism, and therefore he is also in hell. Now, this is the way in which Europe has been looking at its past. It is always in vengeance. It is always in exclusiveness. The ancient Greeks and the Romans were very good for making colonial empires. Romans were a good model for colonization. The Greeks were also good for trade and scientific invention and rational thinking and things like that. But they were still pagans. They will not have heaven. So you can see why Aurobindo makes it clear that don't go anywhere else if you want to revive yourself. Just follow your own ancient tradition. So this is a very vital point he makes, and it is in this that the vital spirit of India and the revival of India lives. Then he goes on to say, and this is very important, and this is how Sri Aurobindo becomes very different from all those Indian reformers, philosophers, writers who came just before him or after him. He says that the most essential part of the Indian tradition is not just spirituality, but it is the handling of the material world most meticulously, most aesthetically, to create beauty, to create perfection, to create thoroughness, to create complete control over material things. Because this is what India cultivated through the practice of arts. Not just one art, but so many kinds of art. And in that expression of art, India was exuberant. It made not just 10 or 12 temples, it made thousands of temples. And every temple or a big temple was full of massive detail. He appreciated this as vitality. To Jawaharlal Nehru, this was offensive. Yes, he has said so. Nehru said that when I go into a Hindu temple, I feel claustrophobic. I feel it's not like Taj Mahal. It's not a place where I can breathe in open. I feel something is oppressing me. But Aurobindo looks at the great sadhana which is part of the temple. The meticulous vitality. When you do that carving on a gopuram, 100 feet or 50 feet, when you do it inside a prasad, when all over, inside, everywhere, nothing is left, then that is vitality. And I don't have time, otherwise I would have read. Indian art, remarkable power and beauty. So this is something that is the most essential thing. Now, you know that when he developed his philosophy, then this whole concept of descent of the supernatural is descent of the Shakti, is descent of the vitality. And that cannot happen unless there is a pursuit of art. In Sri Aurobindo's world, if you do not have art, you cannot have sadhana. Am I wrong, sir? It is essential, part of sadhana, because that is the truth about this world. Aurobindo is the great modern Indian philosopher who has given us the, I don't know how you pronounce it, but in French it's raison d'être or something like that. Yeah. That is the essential reason for sadhana. It is beautiful. So pursuit of beauty is pursuit of truth. And it is descent of that vitality. It is descent of that Shakti. And therefore, he says that India has been doing this socially, culturally, because even if you go to a humble hut in our land, you will find that they have done some decoration which belongs to their lifestyle, their tradition. There is some kind of a painting, some decoration, and they do it ritually. They do it on festivals. They do it as an essential thing. Now, pursuing art as an essential ritual is not religious slavery. It is recreating the beautiful every year and every time. See, this vision of art is possible. This vision of art is possible only if you are a lover of murtis and idols. If you think that idols or Buddha or images are anti-God, or that idol worship is something forbidden, then you cannot create art. It's a vital difference. All puritanical religions, all idol breakers, all art haters, they have separated the divine from the beautiful. And that is why there is no female god in their world. There is no concept of the divine in female terms, because they are essentially non-artistic. Now, this vitality, which Aurobindo says, is essential to Indian civilization. And he goes on to define that it is an essential value. It is a part of the philosophy of life. देखिए, He says for 3,000 years at least, she has been creating abundantly and incessantly. She means India. She has been creating abundantly and incessantly, lavishly. But lavishness in art is not an expression of decadence. It is an expression of exuberance. With an inexhaustible many-sidedness, republics and kingdoms and empires and philosophies and cosmogonies and sciences and creeds, the variety of rituals, etc., he goes on. Everywhere as on her soil, so in her works, there is a teeming of a superabundant energy of life. So the celebration of this energy of life, this Shakti, which he has earlier defined. This vitality is an essential feature, and that's why India has produced so much art. You know, I had gone to University of Hawaii in 2018 for a conference on India, and I happened to make an observation in my lecture that no country produced so much art as India. Now, I think it's a factual statement, and you will all agree. In terms of quantity also, nobody has produced so much art, not even China. There were people who took offense. They said, you are degrading other cultures. Unfortunately, the man who led the attack was an Indian philosopher who teaches at Hawaii. I said, but if you can prove to me that I am wrong, I'll take back my statement on camera. It's just very simple. In the archaeological history of 5,000 years, you find more art objects in India than you find elsewhere. As simple as that. And the number of these art objects exists today after repeated raids of anti-idolatry and idol breaking. Still so much survives. So what is there to argue about? It's a very simple fact. Now, why this has been so, Sri Aurobindo has made it clear. That this is part of the exuberance and the vitality of the Indian spirit. And if there is to be a renaissance, then this is to be revived. Unfortunately, people after Sri Aurobindo, I mean the political leaders, have not paid attention to this fact. And Indian arts have been put on the back burner for a long time, especially after the advent of Jawaharlal Nehru, because socialism only likes socialist art. They like a fully controlled system of propaganda, and they admit of no art which is other than propaganda. And that is still one of the biggest bias in our national agenda, socialism. And therefore, there is an inbuilt resistance to art and patronage of art by our political leaders, no matter what their political ideology may be, right or left or center or whatever. But this fundamental thing that spiritual sadhana, spiritual welfare is rooted in the artistic ritual. And that is what is called the tradition of Mimamsa, the tradition of Yajna, the tradition in which you ritually surrender to the cosmic forces what you have, and you recreate a world of yourself and for you by this ritual. So the whole artistic world is rooted in this Vedic tradition of Mimamsa, which is different from the tradition of Vedanta in the sense that Vedanta is the final experience, but the experience begins in this. Actually, in the world of Sri Aurobindo, there is no beginning or end. They are two together all the time. This is the most essential thing. There have been this kind of thought earlier also, particularly in Kashmir Shaivism, in which the idea of beauty is perennially Shiv, and it does not lose its material content at any level, but becomes totally inseparable. This has been the earlier idea of Tantra or Shakti Sadhana, and it was reinstated, but very specifically in artistic terms by Sri Aurobindo. Then, when he says that things are to be defined in terms of opulent living, in terms of exuberant production, there also have to be certain guidelines of discipline. And therefore he says that the evolution of Shastras is very essential. That for every Vidya, that for every creative field, that for every science or system of knowledge, there was a Shastra. And he says that Shastra is one of the most essential element of living. And he goes on to define that this cannot happen unless there is a rigorous discipline in the creation of art. Art and creation is neither individualistic nor it is bohemian. The European idea of the bohemian artists, of Dada and Salvador Dali and pointillism and all that period where the painter would not take a bath for 10 days or 1 month, and the more you stink, the better painter you are. So he doesn't approve of that. He says that the essential spirit is the Atma or the spirit, that it is beneficial for all, that is dharma, and how it is practiced is the discipline or the shastra. So, he recognizes a method of dealing with the material Shakti, so that the Shakti doesn't sweep you away sweep you away and you get swept and lose your feet and standing. it is to be disciplined. And therefore, all these complicated Shastras and dozens of Shastras for Aurobindo are an expression of the vitality, not of constraint. He understands that this is not to subdue your spirit. This is not to kill you by discipline, but to elevate you by discipline. So he matches this tremendous vitality with control which is created. And he is talking of the most ancient tradition, reaffirming that tradition. And he's doing all this in one single piece of writing, essay. So you can understand how deep and how enlightened in the true sense the person is, because he's able to say almost everything. So he says, known to be useful for life and interesting and to the mind, even for instance, to such practical and minute as the breeding and training of horses and elephants and doing everything which is of material use. So he says there is going to be a Shastra, there is going to be a manual, there is going to be a whole series of disciplined thinking, even for very humble small things like how you breed elephants, how you breed horses. So from drama and art and philosophy down to some practical thing, there has to be a discipline. And that is the expression of the vitality. You see, we have this notion which still continues that the Brahminical approach to life was oppressive. That teaching of Shastras is something which constrains your mind. That it is something which kills creativity. Aurobindo shows that the opposite is true. It is not killing creativity, but it is creative in the best sense. Now, the last thing that I would like to draw your attention regarding how Aurobindo defined Renaissance of India and the rising of the vital spirit of India, the tremendous vitality of India, is that all this which we have inherited has to be practiced in modern times and made relevant and useful and applicable to the present. It is something for the present that this needs to be done. Unless you connect it to the present and transform your present and discover new ways of application, this shall not be of use. And he says that when this happens, then there is the deepest satisfaction of living. That you are a complete person. You are a most satisfied person. In Sanskrit, the word for that is Atma Santushti. And you'll be surprised to know that the last and the final chapter of Manusmriti is about Atma Santushti. The man who says that I am fulfilled person is the happiest person. Self-fulfillment is the final goal of an individual as well as a nation, as well as being an expression of the tremendous vitality of India. Thank you very much.
So we advance